Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. Welcome to this breakdown of Hokuseiho, Sumo's gangly ass marathon boy. In past breakdowns, we've gone through full bashos of material and picked apart each fight, but this time we're going with a different approach. Hokuseiho has 4 bashos completed in Makuuchi, and 60 fights is kinda overkill, plus his average fight is about 5 times longer than for the rest of the division. That's not an exaggeration. Those 60 fights of his, clipped out with very little video before or after each fight, runs about 32 minutes. That means his average fight time is 31 or 32 seconds, as opposed to the Makuuchi average of around 6. So we're going to focus on some core aspects of how he fights and look at specific matches that display the concepts at hand. Let's start with a list of strengths and weaknesses we can see fairly often with Hokuseiho. For strengths, there's his reach and the leverage he can apply. Now, these traits are associated with his height, but I have height listed as a weakness. The reason, briefly, is that even though his height also gives him long arms, it's the long arms that are an advantage, not being tall. It's not the same thing. High-level basketball and volleyball players, for example, sometimes have unusually long arms because it helps them with their sports. Likewise, his height allows him the option of applying leverage in a way his opponents can't, but he still has to be able to do it. His height advantage may offer leverage, but there are other ways to get leverage on an opponent, and it's the leverage itself that presents an advantage. His height is more of a weakness because his natural center of gravity is higher than everyone else's, and it makes him more vulnerable to being undercut by his smaller opponents. These weaknesses aren't inescapable, but in a sense he maximizes the disadvantage because he has such an upright stance. In case anyone's wondering, by the way, I don't think his upright style is due to his knee injury. Here's a fight from March 2021, several months before he got hurt, and he still doesn't get very low. Balance is another strength. I think a lot of us see his ability to resist pushes while on the rope, and that's part of it, but he sometimes gets yoinked around the ring and yet manages to keep his feet. His resistance to belt maneuvers is related to his balance, but it's particularly remarkable how often he makes very little attempt to defend his belt, yet his opponents still can't do anything with it. His Yorikiri power is related to his leverage. Once he gets an opponent moving backwards with belt control, he's very difficult to stop. And especially when he gets in trouble, sometimes he can still overwhelm his opponent physically and find the win. As for his weaknesses, one is how easy he is to push around in the center of the ring away from the Tawara. For a guy who can apply such good balance while on the rope, it's surprising to see how easily opponents can sometimes get him to the rope. It seems like he's fine with getting pushed because he's confident he can resist when it matters, but that doesn't always work out. He's also extremely defensive. This is why his average match time is so long. He's a lot like Ichino-jo in that way. Problem is, Ichino-jo was a little shorter and had more bulk, so he could weigh on his opponents and wear them out purely by attaining the right position. Hokuseiho's height allows him to lean down on anyone in theory, but he still can't apply the same idea quite as effectively. In any case, when a match stalls, it often looks like he's waiting for his opponent to give him an opening rather than find a way to make one himself. This may be a question of approach, or it could be that he has a limited arsenal of offensive maneuvers, making patience the right call at this point in his career. Regardless of why this happens though, watching the fights where his offense works makes it sometimes frustrating to see him get bogged down in a match where he should be able to force the action to his advantage. Moving right along, the flip side of the incredible strength that gets him out of trouble is that he sometimes ends up in bad positions and relies on that strength to get him out of trouble. It's like a basketball player with a 48-inch vertical. If he really needs to score, he knows he can sky over his opponents, so he doesn't worry that much about improving his jumper. But that leaves him vulnerable to anyone who can defend when he attacks the basket and force him to try something else. Similarly, when Hokuseiho meets guys who can stand up to his power, it looks like he never really has a chance. And the final weakness, the number of times he seems content to fight with one arm. It's asterisk though, because it might not be an issue anymore. That's a topic for later. Now let's look at some matches that help clarify what these traits look like in action. We'll start with his very first Makuuchi match against Oho. On the Tachiai, Hokuseiho brings his right hand in low. Prior to September, he seemed almost addicted to going for this underhand front grip. Oho knows this, so he insta-clamps and drives Hokuseiho back by the neck. As they near the rope, Oho transitions from a clamp to a push with the left, but this is where big body Hokuseiho plants and simply resists the push. Then he just walks away. I can't stress enough how ridiculous this is. Usually, if a guy gets pushed to the rope off the tachi but plants his foot and resists, it's a push-pull situation, or maybe he sidesteps to escape, trying to maintain a front-facing position relative to his opponent. Hokuseiho literally walks out of the push, then turns just in time to catch Oho encroaching again. Oho's still in a good spot here. Having your whole body over an opponent's leg is generally a really good position, so Oho tries to body Hokuseiho out. That long-ass arm is already back in place with the underhand grip though, so Hokuseiho turns aside and puts his knee on the inside of Oho's. Oho has to respect the throw, so he drops his weight, and Hokuseiho uses the moment to get in a more balanced position. It's easier because he never committed to the throw. Because he's such a defensive fighter, he's much more inclined to work for a stable position than to take an awkward spot and try to turn it into an instant win. And as much as I might bag on the guy, let's give credit where it's due. As Hokuseiho finds the better position, he wedges his hand under Oho's right arm specifically to push it up and create space to grab the belt. With the leverage his height gives him, it's difficult for anyone to resist his push once he's got the double grip, especially someone who's never faced him before. It takes a bit, but he maneuvers Oho around and out, and Oho is essentially helpless to stop it. Let's look at the list and consider what we saw. First, his attempt at the underhand grip, even though it didn't land, is an attempt to apply his leverage advantage. It's very predictable, though understandably so. Hokuseiho locking in a good grip there and giving an opponent a front wedgie is as close to a win button as you can find in the sport. As I mentioned, he only just seemed to clue into the fact his opponents knew it was coming and were good enough to stop it from accomplishing anything. Second, Oho's immediate push is an example of Hokuseiho not being that difficult to move around the ring. His resistance at the rope, the walk away, and not ending up in the fifth row after walking away are all where his balance kicks in. Threatening the Uwatanage without really committing to it in order to keep Oho honest is a sign of his positive defensive qualities, as is his maneuvering of Oho's arm to find a way to the belt. This is very much one of those moments where he shows the ability to create an opening, and we'd love to see more of that. Once he's on the belt, the Yorikiri power at his disposal is obvious. Now let's check out day 3 for March, where he faced Kinbozan. This whole fight is flat out belt dominance. Both guys get a double grip, and look at this. Kinbozan does the sumo hop into Hokuseiho, and Hokuseiho doesn't move. That's not even meant metaphorically, like he shifts a little but maintains the same relative position. He does not move. That is his resistance to belt maneuvers amped up to 11, which, for whatever reason, really kicks in against Kinbozan. Once he lifts the belt and Kinbozan's weight starts getting up, Hokuseiho is able to move him back. Kinbozan tries to recover by tipping to his right and off-balancing Hokuseiho a little, but Hokuseiho isn't moved nearly far enough for it to have an impact. He simply keeps walking Kinbozan back and out. Bear in mind, Kinbozan and Oho are both about 3 to 4 inches shorter than Hokuseiho. There are plenty of opponents against whom Hokuseiho will enjoy a greater height advantage, but he can still apply enough leverage here to make it basically a fool's errand for Kinbozan to try a belt battle. Oho might have lost to a similar attack in the end, but at least he took a smart approach at the start. Hokuseiho's next match was against Mitoryu. On the tachi, it looks a little odd from this angle that Hokuseiho doesn't get the belt right away with his low right hand, even though it seems like he can. As it turns out, he landed the grip immediately on the other side, so he was more focused there. This is what really makes his reach so dangerous. Even when his opponents are big enough to body him up, it's incredibly difficult to keep him off the belt completely. He pushes his hips in with the double grip, then, when Mitoryu resists, he turns his body and wraps his right hand around Mitoryu's back to change the attack angle. When he can't get enough of a push to win, his defensive reflexes kick in, and he immediately drops his hips back rather than overforce the attack. It looks like this defensive approach gets him in trouble when Mitoryu steps left, gets clear of the rope, and drives Hokuseiho back fairly easily. However, this is where Hokuseiho's resistance to belt attacks meets with the ease of pushing him around the ring. Despite the good grip and the drive backwards, Hokuseiho is never really in trouble. Hokuseiho is utterly confident that when his feet hit the hay, his opponent isn't going to move him any further. And that's what happens here. He gathers his footing and gets distance from the boundary as easily as Mitoryu did. After that, once he gets a good hip pop and Mitoryu starts moving the wrong way, Hokuseiho presses that advantage to the end. In this case, when Hokuseiho popped his hips, Mitoryu's reaction gave him an opening, but that's kinda why Mitoryu is a Juryo regular. By itself, that move doesn't work consistently against better competition. His next match against Ichi no Jo was Hokuseiho's first real big boy fight as a Makuuchi guy. At the start, I don't know what Hokuseiho's doing here. His right hand goes low as usual, but it doesn't go in for the belt right away. It skews to the side, lands under Ichi's arm, and then takes the belt a moment later. It's a very standard grip though, so I assume changing the arm angle was either some kind of strategy that just landed him in a normal position, or he was nervous and it ended up looking weird. Sometimes young guys feel like they need to try something different against the established pros. No big deal, now they're in the eternal dance of sumo, where both of them are pretty comfortable. From here the fight runs quite long, so I'm gonna skip around. Around 12 seconds in, after some jostling, Ichi no Jo works his right shoulder under Hokuseiho's left arm to get it at an awkward angle, so Hokuseiho pulls it back and tries to drive it inside. However, Ichi leans forward, forces his arm up, and the attempt goes nowhere. This isn't Hokuseiho really trying to force the action, he's just getting his arm out of a very awkward position. Around the 35-second mark, Ichi does a hip drive, but finds out what everyone else has been learning about how hard it can be to get Hokuseiho to move that way. This is where Hokuseiho's leverage does a lot of work on defense. Because he's the taller man, when Ichi no Jo tries to drive him back, even though he gets straightened up, his center of gravity doesn't really rise much. He's able to keep his feet firmly planted and continue leaning on Ichi. This is another reason why it's kind of wild that a lot of guys do slide him around with relative ease. He should be able to buckle down like this against just about anyone. There will be exceptions to every rule, of course, it's just there are an awful lot of exceptions here. And if he actually allows himself to be slid around sometimes, I'm genuinely not sure why. Maybe that's one of the places where my sumo knowledge still falls short. Anyway, Ichi has opposite grips, underhand and slightly in front on the left, over top of the belt on the right and slightly around back. He should whoop just about anyone from here, but when he drives forward again, Hokuseiho mostly stands his ground once more. Hokuseiho though has to realize this is just slowly losing. He lets his left arm dangle, we'll get to talking about these moments, but this time doesn't leave it for long before trying to jam it down and inside again when Ichi turns his body. The timing on this is excellent. We can see he doesn't make the decision to do this until Ichi opens up his right side to allow for it, but does react to the opening very quickly. He's successful at getting the arm in, but somewhat surprisingly, he wraps the arm under Ichi's right. I have to assume he's trying to dislodge Ichi's hand, but this was never going to work. Maybe going for the belt would have been doomed as well though. Ichi no Jo was basically a bigger, stronger, and more skilled version of Hokuseiho. But even if he didn't stand much chance of winning, this fight is an example of how Hokuseiho sometimes gets lulled into being too defensive. In a standoff that lasted well over a minute, the only two times he made any sort of aggressive move was when he did it to recover from a bad position, and when he finally saw he had to do something or inevitably lose. Ichi no Jo didn't offer a moment of weakness for him to take advantage of, and he couldn't figure out what to do. A similar thing happened in his next fight against Daishoho. Once they locked up, Hokuseiho just kinda sat there while Daishoho made some moves to attack. Hokuseiho sort of attacked once when they did this little do-si-do spin, but otherwise he just waited until Daishoho found a good moment and drove him out. So far we've covered examples of these traits. Now let's touch on height. The core issue with being so tall in a grappling sport is, like I said, that Hokuseiho's natural center of gravity is higher than everyone else's. Yeah, I also said that this wasn't an issue against Ichi no Jo, but that was an instance where his height and leverage allowed him to maintain his natural center of gravity, which is, natural. It's easier to work with. But with a higher natural center of gravity, if it gets lifted further, it's even more trouble for him than it would be for a lot of other guys. This also makes him a juicy target for a pure trip, and it's kind of incredible that it took as long as it did for anyone to make a real attempt at it. You might expect that I'm going to show videos of his losses to Midori Fuji, and their Aki fight is an example of him getting tripped up, but there are other matches that better point to these ideas. Sticking with March, here's his fight against Takanosho on day 7. Hokuseiho stands up on the Tachiai like usual, and it doesn't take long for Takanosho to get after his neck. This is a similar idea to what Oho did in that first fight, but Hokuseiho just yeets him back. but Hokuseiho's tendency not to attack comes to play yet again, as he doesn't even move while Takanosho flies back, recovers, and attacks again. On the second attempt, his leg drive, by the way, have you ever really looked at this dude's thighs? They're ridiculous. Lifts Hokuseiho just a bit. That's enough to get him to the rope in a somewhat precarious position, but even though we've seen Hokuseiho manage from a spot like this before, Takanosho has also seen enough to understand there's no way to win other than throwing his entire body into Hokuseiho's and hoping for the best. And it works. Takanosho also beat Hokuseiho on day 9 in July in a similar fashion. Now let's watch Takarafuji do some work, because he's become Hokuseiho's daddy, even though he's old enough to theoretically be Hokuseiho's daddy. This is day 12 of Haru. Takarafuji starts with his arms low to block Hokuseiho's best grip and doesn't care if those long arms end up catching him around the back. He secures his own grip around the back on both sides, and even though he's using the belt as opposed to Takanosho's pushes, his idea is basically the same. He drives forward to get Hokuseiho to bounce back, and before Hokuseiho can drop his weight, Takarafuji gets his own body low enough to straight up get Hokuseiho off the ground. Hokuseiho actually recovers remarkably well considering the situation, but he brings his left foot parallel with his right. This is more or less a natural stance for him, but it probably shouldn't be, because it just gives Takarafuji another opportunity to lift him up. Similarly to Takanosho, it takes every ounce of force and body weight he can muster, but he does get Hokuseiho out. This is their next fight from day 2 of Natsu in May. Hokuseiho wisely makes a point of tying up Takarafuji's arms, but Takarafuji turns his body to the right and gets a good controlling position focused on Hokuseiho's right arm. Hokuseiho shoves down on Takarafuji's right arm, grabbing the wrist to free his arm from Takarafuji's hold, and once that's done, he seems to have recovered to a balanced position. But once again, Takarafuji's ludicrous leg strength allows him to lift Hokuseiho just enough to dislodge his balance and get him out of the ring. Finally, here's their fight from the first day of September. Hokuseiho has finally stopped bringing one arm low on the tachiai all the time and gets a really nice push off immediately. As soon as Takarafuji reaches around his back, he grabs that arm and yanks it straight up while pinching in on Takarafuji's left. This is not a bad position at all as long as he can do something with it, but he can't keep the left arm controlled as Takarafuji manages to free it and gets both hands around Hokuseiho's upper back. This still isn't a terrible position for Hokuseiho. As Takarafuji goes for the belt, he could possibly clamp the arms and reduce how much power can be used to lift him. Instead, though, he just loses his damn mind and wraps his arms around Takarafuji's head like he's been practicing Muay Thai instead of Sumo. This offers no effective defense, and Hokuseiho gets pushed back and out with so little resistance it looks like he was too embarrassed to stay in the ring and fight. Hokuseiho is frankly pretty fortunate that there aren't many guys like Takarafuji and Takanosho who have the completely bonkers leg strength to beat him in this way. Fun fact: Takarafuji is 3-0 against Hokuseiho, Hokuseiho is 5-0 against Kinbozan, and Kinbozan is 2-0 against Takarafuji. Sumo, when you get down to it, is just the world's biggest game of paper, rock, scissors. Then, of course, there's his match against Kiribayama, where Kiri hit him with a nice Sotogake. This is what really seemed to break the sense of semi-invincibility around Hokuseiho, that it takes a superhuman effort to find a win against him. At least, this and when Oho scored a win with the very same maneuver the next day, because there's basically no chance Oho would have gone for this without seeing someone else do it first. Next, since his strength and his over-reliance on it are basically two sides of the same coin, let's check those out together. Here's his fight from day 8 of Haru against Kotoeko. After a bit of a tangle on the tachiai, Kotoeko gets his hand in Hokuseiho's armpits. Hokuseiho reacts by getting his hand around Kotoeko's triceps and pulling. Now, I may still be learning the finer points of sumo, but even I know you're not gonna beat a guy who's got his hands jammed into your armpits by pulling his hands even further into your armpits. And the worse Hokuseiho's position gets, the more he appears determined to keep trying to free himself this way. Finally, he tries something different, pulling his left shoulder back and gets rid of the pushing hand on that side. Hokuseiho slides back as Kotoeko continues pushing, but Kotoeko pulls down on his left arm rather than continuing what he surely knows would be a useless push, sending Hokuseiho stumbling a step to the left. Kotoeko gets the best position he can, arms around Hokuseiho's back and trying to push up to get him moving backwards. It kinda works, but Hokuseiho is able to use that insane reach to get the back of Kotoeko's belt, maintain his balance, and then he uses nothing but brute force to get Kotoeko to the ground. Obviously, Hokuseiho's reach and pure power got him the win in the end, but he spent far too long trying to brute force Kotoeko's hands out of position without having any real thought as to what might work. I realize that in the moment, especially for a young athlete new to this level, it's a lot to think about, but it doesn't matter if you blame it on a lack of experience or training in these types of situations. He was still way too reliant on his strength alone to get him out of the situation, and it nearly cost him the match. And this is where we get to talk about those f***ing arm dangles. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, just stick with me. Bear in mind, I'm only going to talk about the ones that happened in Makuuchi, but best believe he was doing this nonsense before he hit the top division. The first one is the least egregious. This was day 6 of Haru against Daishoho. As you can see, his arm is a little limp later in the fight, but it's not exactly disconnected from what's happening. Let's be clear, other guys do this sometimes, and it can be helpful in reducing how hard the arm has to work. If they're in a stalled position, that saved energy could be crucial in winning later. It's not an optimal thing to do, but Hokuseiho should be able to easily clamp the arm in an instant if it's necessary. The camera angle changes at an unfortunate moment, but we can see Hokuseiho's arm pull back. There's a good chance he was going to try to drive the arm inside like he attempted against Ichi no Jo. However, Daishoho uses that moment to turn him in that direction, bouncing him to the rope. If you want to be critical of Hokuseiho, the end is a better place for it. It looked like he was reaching for Daishoho's belt to defend himself, but it turns out his arm's just hanging out doing nothing. In the moment where the fight still hung in the balance though, it wasn't awful. Then came day 10 against Ura. Ura, fully aware that getting in a paused position against Hokuseiho was not to his advantage, kept it moving as best he could. Eventually he started trying one-arm throws, which aren't exactly optimal, but getting his hand all the way up on Hokuseiho's head for a better push would have gotten him out of position for the throw itself. Nonetheless, Hokuseiho's essentially getting dragged around by his grip on Ura's belt. Now, at first, when we see him do the arm dangle, it's not great, but it's not awful. It's a long reach to Ura's belt, and Ura's right arm isn't placed where he can do much with a clamp. But when Ura tries another yank throw and Hokuseiho defends it, now he's in a much better position to get his left hand somewhere useful, be it clamping the forearm, grabbing the belt, whatever. He does nothing with it though. It ends up working out okay. Ura reaches up for the head because he's out of ideas, and Hokuseiho stops him and walks him out. But what he did was essentially him showing a complete lack of regard for Ura as a threat, at least in that position. As it turns out, he was right, so maybe credit to him for that? Any coach in any sport will tell you, though, that while they might tolerate a bad habit from an athlete who can still make things work out, it's not what they want to see, and it's the kind of thing that leads to gifted athletes never reaching their potential. Next one to watch is day 15 of Haru against Ichi Yamamoto. Strap in, by the way, because even though we won't go through everything in detail, there are 10 of these fights. Anyway, after Ichi Yamamoto does Ichi Yamamoto things on the Tachiai, Hokuseiho finds his footing and tries to fling Ichi out by the belt. Starting with his left arm around Ichi's right and pulling on it is fine, but then he lets his left arm hang off to the side rather than use it to push down on Ichi's head. Pushing on the head means reaching back across, which could reduce his rotation slightly, but given the length of his arms, he should gain much more from not allowing Ichi to pull back defensively than he loses in momentum. But even that's not the real arm dangle. After some hand fighting, Hokuseiho leans on Ichi and just lets his arm sit there. He was literally just fighting for control. If he wants to take a moment before attacking again, that's one thing, but they stood in this position for over a minute. It took until Ichi Yamamoto tried forcing something that Hokuseiho changed it up and clamped the arm, eventually wearing Ichi down and getting the win. Again, in a grappling situation, Ichi Yamamoto should basically never win this matchup, so I guess Hokuseiho didn't have to take him that seriously, but it's why he needs to learn how to attack less capable grapplers at the lower end of the division if he ever wants to compete with the guys at the top. The point should be generally made, so let's just show some of the other instances more briefly. In his very next fight, for example, on the first day of May, he went against Daishoho in a 3-minute match that saw him arm dangle for a good 2 minutes plus combined, and also leave his left arm out when he went for one-handed throws. He won by getting Daishoho off balance with one throw attempt and switching to a Yorikiri drive, but it was a superior athlete winning more so than a superior wrestler. On day 4, he faced Ryuden, who is a lot more active than Daishoho. Ryuden kept pulling him around, but Hokuseiho just leaned on him like a bored bear who doesn't want to listen to the zookeeper. He essentially held an Uwatanage position like he was going to attempt the one-handed throw at any moment, and let Ryuden maintain what looked like a permanently advantageous side position. Yet again, however, his opponent just could not get him out from a static position, and he eventually slung Ryuden to the ground. After that, he had several short matches where he didn't get much chance to dangle the arm. Then we get to day 13 against Kiribayama. He kept his left arm a little more active, but it definitely looks like he'd gotten used to being fine with it not being actively engaged all the time, and when we watch the Sotogake again, we can pretty clearly see that he's not always going to be able to latch that dangling arm in somewhere in reaction to his opponent's attack. And on day 14 against Oho, he yet again tries the one-handed throw without success. Oho smartly waits for him to try it one more time, since he leaves himself wide open for the trip in the process. Despite his 8-7 record in May, Banzuke luck saw him jump from Maegashira 11 to 6, and that was the level where this nonsense stopped working. He took the same approach against Ura as before, which, in fairness, had worked, but this time Ura kept trying to wrap around him like a cartoon character wrapping string around a giant's ankles until he falls down. Because not putting that left hand to use put him in such a sideways position relative to Ura, and he doesn't have the foot mobility to keep up with the spins, Ura worked in behind him and got yeety with it. Day 10 against Shodai, he tried the same thing, and it kinda worked. Somewhat unluckily, his big-ass toes wrapped over the Tawara and touched the sand, so his win was reversed. And against Meisei on day 14, he went straight dangle after his initial throw attempt was thwarted. It looked like maybe he was starting to learn though. After a few seconds, he held Meisei's wrist. It's not much, but it's better than all the examples we'd seen to this point. So, after having covered all this, let's go through his September tournament and see what it might tell us about his chances of a strong November. We'll break this down not by wins and losses, but by the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good fights are ones where he fights smart, does nothing wrong, and takes at least defensible approaches to each moment of the fight. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to end in a win. You can fight well, especially against a superior opponent, and still lose. Bad fights are ones where he gets into poor positions that he should be able to avoid, even if he's able to overcome them and win. Ugly fights are ones where he does something preposterous that there's no real excuse for when performing sumo at this level. Again, he could still win those fights, but that doesn't make him any less ugly. Match 1 is the one we already saw against Takarafuji. This goes straight in the ugly bin. It starts out bad, but the head clinch is simply ridiculous. Takarafuji seems to be a bad matchup for him, but it's one thing to have difficulty against an opponent and another to look completely lost. Day 2 was against Endo. As previously mentioned, he's stopped automatically going for the low grab on the Tachiai, and they get in a tangle instead. Hokuseiho gets a nice clamp around Endo's upper left arm and maneuvers him into a solid throw attempt. Endo's able to recover, but not only does Hokuseiho maintain that high clamp in the ensuing chaos, he gets an equal clamp on the left side once he finds his footing. Endo's got the belt in his right hand, but his leverage is absolutely gone. Hokuseiho can do what he wants here. After nearly a minute in this position, Endo takes one small step with his left foot, and Hokuseiho uses that moment to pull up out his arms and drive him back and out. The one point of criticism here is that Hokuseiho could have realistically done this anytime he wanted. He had Endo's center of gravity pulled way up, and it would have been difficult at best for Endo to resist anytime Hokuseiho chose to attack. This is a good fight from him though. Day 3 saw him against Matakiumi. The Exozeki took a page from Takanosho and Kotoeko, pushing under the arms and never letting Hokuseiho get settled before using his full body weight to drive the big man out. We'll call this bad. Hokuseiho didn't have time to do anything egregiously wrong, but he needs to learn how to defend his friggin' pits. Day 4 was Sadano Umi. They attack each other's belts and seem about evenly matched at first. Hokuseiho, though, applies that leverage in getting Sato no Umi lifted up, and then finally lands a really good Uwatanage, forcing Sato no Umi's head down as Sato no Umi tries desperately to hang on. It's possible this is an opponent-specific thing. His win against Sato no Umi in July included a similar head push, although it was more of a brief finishing idea. Still, this is infinitely better than the arm drag Uwatanage attempts he made over and over in the past. Definitely a good fight. He faced Myogiryu on day 5, someone he was 2-0 against coming in. Myogiryu takes a reasonably smart approach, as he often does, getting his right hand under Hokuseiho's armpit and using his left arm to control Hokuseiho's right. Maybe he could have found a win from here anyway, but Hokuseiho again, somehow, ended up hugging his opponent's head, and Myogiryu had a pretty straightforward Yorikiri win. One more for the ugly pile. Day 6 was Midori Fuji, and this was a pretty long one. After Midori Fuji dug his way inside on the Tachiai, Hokuseiho found himself in an awkward position. He had Midori's belt over top with his left hand, but Midori had his right forearm well trapped. So there's no arm dangle, but it was always the left arm that dangled, so that might not mean much. In any case, once they're locked up, Midori makes occasional moves, but they look like feints. He can do this with relative impunity though, because it's clear Hokuseiho only wants to move in reaction to his opponent. Then, about a minute in, we see Hokuseiho's right hand is free. This should be an opportunity for him, since he very much prefers to work with his right. But instead of looking for openings over the top, or trying to dislodge Midori from his belt, he immediately tries to ram his right hand inside of Midori's left, even though Midori's arm is pressed in so tightly. And he just gets himself trapped because he doesn't seem to know what else to do. Eventually Midori gets his knee around back of Hokuseiho's left leg, but uses it to off-balance Hokuseiho and push him out rather than trip him down. We'll put this in the bad category. Not knowing what to do with his strong hand in a static position against a much smaller opponent pushes it towards ugly, but overall it was a relatively standard level of inactivity and just waiting to lose. Plus, Midori Fuji's pretty good at this stuff. Day 7 was a match with Kinbozan, and it went pretty much how all their matches go. If anything's interesting about this, it's that Kinbozan is definitely more of a push-thrust kind of wrestler, but he seems either hell-bent on beating Hokuseiho at his own game, or feels like he can't keep the necessary distance for his own style to work. It's hard to think that's the case though, seeing as the much shorter Takanosho and Mitakayumi have succeeded with similar approaches. Anyway, for Hokuseiho, he did what he needed to do, so we can toss this in the good pile. Day 8 against Kodoshoho saw, incredibly, a Hoku Henka. And yeah, I'm calling it a Henka because it looks like he intended to fully sidestep, but was just too slow to make the full movement. That being the case, it wasn't the smoothest thing in the world, but it did get him enough of a side position to keep Kodoshoho from recovering before he could drop him. Nothing particularly special here except the change in tactics, but even though it wasn't pretty, he did apply the tactical change well enough. Good fight. Day 9 was against Chiyoshoma. Chiyoshoma immediately attacked Hokuseiho's upper chest and neck, which, as we've seen, has been effective for several guys, even if it doesn't always result in victory. They trade slaps, and even here it's like Hokuseiho only thinks of doing it because Chiyoshoma does it first. Chiyoshoma keeps Hokuseiho at bay, and when Hokuseiho misses, Chiyoshoma gets in on the belt. This is almost a questionable decision. Chiyo is doing awfully well at a distance despite Hokuseiho's reach advantage, and getting inside also gives Hokuseiho a chance at his own belt. Chiyo has his right hand on the belt slightly around Hokuseiho's back, and even though he has an underhand grip with the left, he keeps working his left over so it's on the same side as the right hand. This is an unusual grip setup, but it makes sense in this case. Having both hands on the same side gives Chiyo more leverage to pull his body down in that direction, which lets him battle the power of Hokuseiho's clamp. It works pretty decently, enough to make Hokuseiho take action. When Hokuseiho pulls his right arm free and reaches over top of Chiyo for a belt grab with his left, Chiyo releases with his own left hand and pulls Hokuseiho forward with his right, just enough to give him an angle around the side. From there, he wraps his right arm further around Hokuseiho's back to secure his position. This is outstanding work from Chiyoshoma. He moves his right foot behind Hokuseiho's left, threatening some sort of trip or off-balancing maneuver, then brings it around front to actually get Hokuseiho's left foot off the ground. Now he has Hokuseiho hopping, not just on one foot, but on the leg with the bad knee. He doesn't have the juice to get Hokuseiho all the way out though. He still has his really good position, so he jams his leg in front of Hokuseiho's again and keeps it there as he pulls around, making Hokuseiho hop in a circle on his bad leg. This is almost sumo poetry. Unfortunately, Hokuseiho is just difficult enough to move and pushes his weight towards Chiyoshoma just enough on that one leg that instead of falling on his own, he falls on Chiyo and wins. As much as I want to throw this in the ugly pile, it's more fair to call it simply bad. Hokuseiho didn't do anything wrong, really. Chiyo used his experience to straight up beat the kid tactically from start to finish. The way Hokuseiho won was the only really ugly part, but you do what you gotta do. Day 10 against Nishiki Fuji was much less interesting. Nishiki Fuji got into a belt fight with someone he absolutely should not get into a belt fight with, and Hokuseiho had a fairly easy victory handed to him. On day 11, Hokuseiho got the Aoyama that's a pain in the ass for everyone, the one that really needs some wins. On the Tachiai, Hokuseiho's inability or unwillingness to produce any forward power invites yet another forceful attack as Aoyama dives inside and starts pushing. Unfortunately for Big Dan, this was a fight where Hokuseiho went back to using the low right grab to start. He gets a good belt grip right away, which, combined with his stance, makes him essentially immovable. Credit to Hokuseiho here. From this side-facing position, he kicks his right leg up, getting Aoyama's left foot off the ground and leaving him open to a push all the way back across the ring. Aoyama saves himself by getting further around Hokuseiho's right leg, limiting how much power Hokuseiho can continue generating. At the edge, Hokuseiho tries a final push, but Aoyama is so secure against the hay that Hokuseiho only succeeds in pushing himself backwards. Aoyama retreats enough to loosen Hokuseiho's belt grip, allowing him to twist with a high clamp and dislodge Hokuseiho completely. Hokuseiho recovers nicely, though his reward is Aoyama's right hand on his face. Aoyama switches to his left hand on Hokuseiho's throat, but as we always say on the channel, holding a push is just asking to get parried, and Hokuseiho obliges in a way we rarely see, not by simply pushing the arm away, but reaching all the way over and bashing Aoyama in the back of the head. Aoyama spins and gets his right hand back on the neck, but doesn't keep it there for long this time, instead switching to pull down on Hokuseiho's head. This is not an actual pull down attempt, but rather a quick off balancing maneuver. As we've seen though, Hokuseiho's balance is quite good, and he recovers before Aoyama can hit him again. When they engage again, Aoyama tries the same tactic, this time with more success. He gets Hokuseiho bent forward far enough to try for an actual pushdown. But Hokuseiho is never really threatened by it, and once they're facing each other again, Aoyama's running out of tricks to use. They re-engage, and this time, Aoyama's looking at Hokuseiho's feet. When Hokuseiho steps forward, Aoyama tries kicking his leg out, but barely makes contact. He wrecks his own balance with the maneuver, but clearly he felt it was his last real chance to go for a win, so it was a risk worth taking. It didn't work, so Hokuseiho finishes things fairly easily. As with the Chiyoshoma fight, Hokuseiho was a step behind Aoyama tactically the whole way. No one expects a young wrestler to have all the tricks of a veteran, but it's noteworthy to see how Hokuseiho is so dependent on his physical gifts to win a match like this when Atami Fuji and Hakuoho, who are even younger, show much more well-rounded skill sets. We have to call this a bad one for Hokuseiho. Despite having run his record up to 7-4, Hokuseiho pulled 3-8 Daishoho on day 12. As usual, they got into a relatively long fight, but a couple things are different. First, and most importantly, there's no arm dangle here. Hokuseiho locks in the belt grip on both sides, gets his weight down, and digs in. He also makes several attempts to press forward, which is all he really needs to do in this position. Daishoho is an inferior opponent, and if Hokuseiho keeps this up, he should always win unless he makes a mistake or Daishoho has some sneaky trick in his back pocket. This is more the type of fight we should see out of Hokuseiho, definitely a good one. Day 13 was against Takanosho, a much more reasonable matchup despite their record disparity. Knowing what's coming, Hokuseiho finally gets his weight forward against Takanosho's push, even stepping forward to force Takanosho back. Takanosho gets his right hand up on Hokuseiho's neck and presses forward. He has a method of winning this matchup that's worked before, and he's going for it again. Even when he doesn't move Hokuseiho and has his arm parried, he recovers and continues to push. Then, from out of left field, maybe out of the skyboxes above the left field bleachers, Hokuseiho steps back away from the push, makes Takanosho partly miss, and hits him with a Hatake Komi. Let's not put too fine a point on it. This is not what Hokuseiho normally does. If he can make this a legitimate part of his game plan against more aggressive opponents, that'll be huge in his development. If you had to decide exactly what the weaknesses he's shown so far mean in total, it's that he's vulnerable to very aggressive opponents. A legitimate step-back ability that keeps those opponents honest should open up a lot more attacking opportunities. But we've only seen this one Hatake Komi so far, and it was almost certainly a tactic practiced for use against Takanosho. There's no way to know how close he is to being able to break this out when he needs it. Regardless, definitely throw this win in the good pile. He got another big Yorikiri guy on day 14 in Tsurugisho. As strong as Tsurugisho is, we can see pretty easily that he can't apply much leverage to Hokuseiho even with a double grip on the belt. Once Hokuseiho steadies himself and lands his own double grip, there's little Tsurugisho can do. Similar to the Kinbozan and Nishiki Fuji fights, this defaults to the good column even though he really just had to not screw it up. Day 15, after running his record to 10-4 and being theoretically in contention for a playoff, he pulled Hoshoryu for the second time in 3 tournaments. They trade belt grips immediately on the Tachiai, and this is an example of what happens when Hokuseiho faces a guy who can deal with his power. Hoshoryu's the one getting Hokuseiho off the ground here, and as soon as Hokuseiho forces his weight down, Hoshoryu twists his right side forward to try and trip up Hokuseiho's left leg. The clamp isn't doing much, so Hokuseiho tries to wedge his right arm inside, but Hoshoryu uses excellent positioning to get his right leg behind Hokuseiho's left, lift it off the ground, and keep it in the air until he can yell timber and fell the giant. I'd actually rate this a good fight for Hokuseiho. Hoshoryu is several levels above him as a wrestler and is not especially troubled by his physical attributes. There wasn't much Hokuseiho could do, but he did what he could. It wasn't a bad effort. So a breakdown of his 10-5 record in Aki includes 9 good fights, 4 bad, and 2 ugly. If you expected that split to look worse, well, so did I when I first started putting the clips together. Granted, his rough start combined with his placement on the Banzuke ended up gifting him about as soft a schedule as he could have hoped for, but he did start to put some things together, especially towards the end of the tournament. Here's the caveat when it comes to hoping for improvement with Hokuseiho though. He seems, frankly, like kind of a dumbass. He just has not learned very quickly, and his progress looks especially slow in comparison with the aforementioned Atami Fuji and his stablemate Hakuoho. Mind you, I don't necessarily mean he's stupid when I say that. A reasonably intelligent person can also be incredibly stubborn, and that would also give us the sort of slowness in putting things together that we get from him. Take some of his bad habits, like the arm dangle and the predictable low grab Tachiai. There's not a chance in hell his coach, Miyagino, watched him do those things and thought, it's fine. For those who don't recall or never knew, Miyagino is Hakuho, aka the GOAT. He knows full well that these things aren't conducive to high-level success. But I'm willing to bet that, in some fashion, what's gone on in that stable is they tried to break Hokuseiho of these bad habits, he kept winning despite them, and eventually they were like, you know what? Go off, kid. Do what you can with it. And when these god-awful tactics eventually bite you in the ass, we're gonna grind them out of you because you won't be able to tell yourself anymore that you're winning and that makes it okay. So he bulled his way through March and May with his dangling arm and his terrible Uwatanage attempts, jumped in rank, got completely punished in July, and then look what happened in September. No more arm dangle, no more going low on the Tachiai to the point of predictability. There was even more aggression and less sitting in a stalled position later in the Basho, although that's a small sample size and may just have been a matter of chance. But his worst habits vanished. Now we get to see if he can replicate any of that against much stiffer competition in Kyushu. He's surrounded by arguably underranked guys in both directions on the Banzuke. It's gonna be a lot tougher, but despite that, I'd still be surprised if he flops to 5-10 again. It seems very likely we'll get a 7-8 or an 8-7 out of him. If he gets to 9 wins, especially if he does it by performing from the start and not flopping his way into an easier schedule, it should be impressive because I don't think he can do it without showing he's turned a corner in his approach and how much he has in his arsenal. If it doesn't happen yet, that's okay. It's one thing to show you can do new and better things, and another to make him habitual. As long as he maintains the more sound approach we saw in Aki, and his knee doesn't fall apart from under him, we should see that better, higher level Hokuseiho within a year at most. But if he goes directly back to trying one-handed yeet nages every third fight, well, every sport has its underachievers, I guess. And that'll do it for our Hokuseiho breakdown. What do you think of his chances in November? I still have Atami Fuji outperforming him in the rank 6 to 10 bracket for you Kachi Clash players out there, but he's not the worst pick. I have him 4th or 5th behind Atami, Mitake Yumi, Kinbozan, and maybe Shonen no Umi or Ryuden. Leave a comment, let me know. Also, if you'd be so kind, give this a like if you enjoyed it, especially if you liked the more targeted breakdown rather than going through full bashos. That kind of thing helps tell me what people are into. Other than that, hopefully I can make something during the basho, time allowing, but I'll see you when I see you. Until then, take care and have a great day.